Hello everyone. This is a narrated PowerPoint video about the use of narrated PowerPoint videos. A meta presentation of sorts about the pedagogic possibilities of this format. In it, I explore how I designed and used narrated PowerPoint videos in a course I taught between April and June this year during COVID-19 lockdown and under ERT conditions. Over that time, I spent many late nights hunched over my laptop, feeling as if I was talking into a void, listening to my disembodied voice and wondering if there was anyone out there. And here I am, doing it all over again, speaking into a new void. But let me begin by briefly describing the course in question. It's an undergraduate course, English 3, part of the Bachelor of Education program. It's a literature course that involves the study of two novels, and Heart of Darkness being one of them, and Things Fall Apart the other. The blurb on the right is from the student's course outline, but all you need to know is that it's framed by post-colonial literary theory, and it places these two novels in conversation with each other. So my focus here is on the narrated PowerPoint videos that form the backbone of the course. But it's important to add that the course included weekly writing tasks because it was a writing intensive course. It included weekly forum discussion questions that were handled by the writing fellows. And it involved a whole series of literary and scholarly readings. Also worth mentioning that one of the stated outcomes of the course was the ability to arrive at your own carefully considered interpretations and positions. So these are the three key concepts on which this presentation, or by which this presentation is framed. Very briefly, the critical, the dialogic, and the multimodal. The critical pertains to critical pedagogy and post-colonial literary theory. The dialogic deals with the multi-voicedness or heteroglossia of the course and the dialogue, both intertextual and intersubjective. And the multimodal, I use a description by Jewett et al. A multimodal approach moves beyond language to examine how a variety of resources, including color, image, sound, spatial and kinesthetic resources, are orchestrated to make meaning. So, most of us are thoroughly familiar with PowerPoint, of course, but a couple of things about what the literature tells us at the moment. Originally, PowerPoint presentations were designed for corporate presentations. The templates, such as the one used to construct this slide, embody corporate norms of communication. So a concern that has been expressed is that instead of adapting to the needs of education, PowerPoint forces education to adapt to its corporate modes of presentation and the values embedded in them. However, all is not lost. We also hear in the literature about PowerPoint slideshows as being seen as a site for new writing. That meaning that it relies on the visual rather than the verbal to communicate ideas, although not necessarily on images per se, and I'll come back to that later in the presentation. Also that tertiary contexts are developing their own discursive norms, that academic disciplines are shaping the kinds of information and text displayed on their screens, and most significantly from my perspective is that if you use multimodal semiotic theory, slide presentations can be understood as part of an integrated, broader lecturing ecology. So there's an interaction of a variety of elements in the lecturing space, including the slide presentation is but one of these elements. Yes, but, and now this is the big but. ERT has shut down that lecturing ecology. All the things that enabled a PowerPoint presentation to come alive seem to have been lost. There's been a huge shift from PowerPoint as part of an embodied interactive lecture to a seemingly vacuum-sealed narrated PowerPoint video. In fact, to me, it feels akin to a frisky little lamb of a PowerPoint presentation being replaced by a vacuum-sealed packet of lamb chops, with all that this analogy suggests relating to spontaneity and dialogue and debate versus static, impermeable artifact that supports passive student engagement. So then, my exploration here is, I suppose, an attempt to test the validity of this analogy. And my questions are, to what extent, if any, can narrated PowerPoint videos enable dialogism and criticality? And also, what can we say about the modal affordances of this format? I'm going to tackle this by taking you through a few examples of slides and focusing on pedagogic design choices and suggesting what they may or may not have achieved. But I am leaving this partly open-ended to hear responses from you, dear viewer, if there's anyone out there, at the webinars. So example 1. Here I use two predominantly visual, non-literary everyday texts to demonstrate the workings of colonial and post-colonial discourses, having just introduced students to post-colonial theory. After an introduction to the highly controversial Tintin in the Congo, a comic book or graphic novel, students are shown a couple of key panels, such as this one. Through a close but relatively quick look at the action, the words spoken by the characters as well as their visual representation, the taken for granted superiority of the white man is evident. The Congolese men are portrayed as primitive and childlike, and colonization is clearly treated as natural and unproblematic. This is juxtaposed with an amazing prize-winning children's picture book called The Rabbits, which presents a critical allegory of the colonization of Australia. These pictures on the screen are double spreads of the first 4 pages of the novel. The colonizers, which are represented as rabbits, are presented as callously brutal and destructive. The story is narrated from the perspective of the indigenous people who experience colonization as devastation and loss, foregrounding their experience and eliciting sympathy from the reader. Because the stories in both cases reside primarily in the visual mode, this discussion can be economically achieved, and it functions as a form of preparation for analyzing colonial and post-colonial discourses in the written mode of the novels. A second example is what I've called voluble images, pictures that do speak 1,000 words. The purpose of the slide was to get students to consider the possible significance of the literature syllabus that was part of Achebe's schooling at an elite colonial school in Nigeria. These are the books that Achebe has stated he was exposed to during his schooling. The text box contains a short extract from one of his essays where he writes about being untroubled by these books that were, and I'm quoting, not about people like us, but about heroic white men battling repulsive natives, to use his own words. Visually displayed around this quotation are the covers of the novels that Achebe has specifically mentioned in his writings, and almost an exact copy emerges of what could be referred to as the children's canon from Britain of that time. My decision to select covers as old as possible emanates from the fact that the visual encodes the datedness of these texts to our students and their foreignness. Visual details like font, clothes people are wearing, not to mention pale blonde looks, speak volumes about the lack of congruence between Achebe, Nigeria, and the books he was reading. And this is, importantly, all able to be taken in at a glance, hence the idea of a picture speaking 1,000 words. Example 3 is about the use of animations to incrementally construct a line of reasoning. And in this particular case, I do this through the use of visuals. So this slide is from the very first narrated PowerPoint video of the course. In fact, it's probably the second or third slide, and it introduces the structure of the course. So initially, we see the two novels, the covers of the two novels, and they are identified as the books that we are going to focus on. Then there's a comment on the different times in which they are written. Then their authors and their time and place of writing are identified. And finally, I introduce the notion of intertextuality, the relationship between these books as being part of an invisible web, possibly, of books in conversation with each other across times and spaces, and sometimes directly, often indirectly. So this kind of pedagogic design, which goes step by step through a number of points, is part of the scaffolding that is useful for rendering tricky concepts accessible to students. Another aspect of this particular slide is that about 5 or 6 slides later, having elaborated on intertextuality and had a look at 2 extracts from the novels with contrasting depictions of the African landscape, I come back to the slide and I add to it. I add a summary or a brief note on the intertextual relationship and a new text to the intertextual web, Achebe's post-colonial deconstruction of Conrad's novel, which is also a core text in the course. I think this is interesting because the repetition of a slide later and the additions to it shows the possibility of working against the enforced linearity of PowerPoint to encode a more recursive design, conceptually speaking. Our next example. Thus far, my examples have been drawn from predominantly visual portions of narrated PowerPoint videos, and we've been working with the full color visual affordances of this mode. But now is probably a good time to confess that I have many slides that are jam-packed with words, and I'll just flick through a few unrelated word-dense slides to show you what I mean. Wall-to-wall words, top to bottom, a speech bubble with a complex definition of postcolonial literary analysis, a large extract from the novel, an extract from one of Achebe's memoirs with Johnny Walker Black Label still going strong. So what is going on here? Why is this? The first part of the answer is because the discipline demands it. This is a literature course. Words are our core business. these are precisely the discipline-specific texts that we want to display visually. We need to work with words and put them on display for consideration, for analysis, for learning more about how they work. And the second reason is that even the verbal is visual. For example, the following slide. It is filled with words, but the words are presented in a way that's attentive to their visual impact and to their spatial placement, which suggests certain differences and certain relationships. A quotation from the poem from which the title of Things Fall Apart is taken is placed in a white banner near the top, below the question about the title. Below that, in a different font and color, is an extract from the book which elucidates the choice of title. Here we have a slide. The next two slides are about the language debate in African literature. Here, Ngugi wa Thiong'o's exact words are significant enough to warrant lengthy quotation, with key sections emboldened and given a standout color. A photograph of Ngugi gazing directly at the viewer also engages visually. The next slide is a Chebe's view on this issue, and similarly lengthy quotations from his works on the issue are placed in speech bubbles alongside a photograph of him gesturing in lecturing mode, or seemingly so, and again, choice of colors, size, and style of fonts, they are all visual elements of the verbal mode. And now, turning to our final set of examples. Text annotation, visually modeling the practice of the discipline. How do you teach students to penetrate a dense, complex, and seemingly impenetrable text? The next few slides are part of a narrated PowerPoint video that I described as a tutorial. Students were given some questions on the first few pages of the novel to answer in advance of watching this video. And then, slowly, in a highly scaffolded way, I took them through these pages in a text spotlighting kind of way. The Nelly, for example, is a cruising yawl, very difficult vocabulary, and students are advised to look around. How do they know it's a boat of some kind? Because of the other words being used around it in the descriptions. The Thames is in England. The town nearby to the west is London. Notice all the references to darkness, even here, the students are asked to think about. And us, who is this? Who is speaking? So already students are able to answer the most basic of basic questions. Where are we when the novel begins? On a boat on the Thames somewhere east of London. And so we continue. And so on. The next set of annotations points out who the people are on the ship, and Marlowe being the only one given a name. It also asks students to pay attention to, again, the narrative voice. There's an I, and then answers the questions about who the narrator is and who is present here. A little bit later, we have again a discussion about Marlowe is starting to speak. He's going to tell a story. There's a story coming. He's interested in the effect of the story on him. It's almost a summary of the novel when he says how I got out there, what I saw, how I went up that river to the place where I first met the poor chap. We talk about the fact that the poor chap is Kurtz, who is in fact despite his complexity, the epitome of evil in many literary circles, and also the metaphor of the internal and external journey. So we have a very scaffolded process of what I refer to as spotlighting the text, in a way that a spotlight tells you what to look at. And the novel is made more accessible to the kind of timid reader that might be put off for life, actually. So this is about helping with access. Students are expected to be able to do this on their own, not only because they have learnt it and there have been a few tutorials of this kind, but because Things Fall Apart is a much more accessible novel. So this is the final paragraph of the novel, and we are just discussing the ironies and the narrative perspective here. So to return to our questions, where does this leave us? Well, I'd like to suggest that the modal affordances of this format can be exploited to assist with access and engagement. But I'm less clear about the presence or the possibilities of critical and dialogic pedagogy here in this particular format, not so much in the course as a whole. So I think I'm going to take the easy way out and leave it open-ended to be discussed at the webinar, and keep wondering about the analogy and the validity of the analogy. And I'll end off with the slide I used to end all the PowerPoints of this course. There's lots to think about, isn't there? Thank you for your attention, and see you at the webinar on Friday.